Right now, it seems like Donovan Mitchell's days as a Cleveland Cavalier are numbered. It seems like either at this deadline or in the offseason, he is going to either request a trade or the Cavs are going to initiate trade discussions with other teams. And as a result, everybody's going to say that this was a mistake by Cleveland to bring in Donovan Mitchell. They gave up all this stuff for a guy that ultimately wanted to leave not that much long after they traded for him. But honestly, this was not a bad decision by them at all. They did not screw this up. Really quickly, though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. With the NBA on Christmas Day coming up right now is an awesome time to get into Prize Picks, and I have an offer for you to go ahead and get started with as well. You can do a 100% deposit match up to $100 when you use code SPORTING. That link is in the description at Prize Picks. And on Christmas Day, they've got a free square set up for you as well. Kevin Durant has to score 1 point on Christmas Day, and then you're going to get that free square to go with your selection. Again, that code is sporting. The link is in the description, and you get that Kevin Durant free square. Now, if you've never done Prize Picks before, the way that it works is you go onto the site and you pick more or less for each of the numbers that they have. So, for example, earlier I mentioned the free square, Kevin Durant, obviously it's 0.5 points. So if he scores a single point, then that obviously would be more. That's a special square, but if you go and look on the site, there's all kinds of options. Whether it be for the NBA, whether it be on Christmas Day, you can have a ton of different stuff picked and selected for Christmas Day NBA basketball. You can mix that in with some NFL stuff, all kinds of different stuff. All you have to do is pick more or less for each of these numbers, put them together in a selection, and if you're correct, you could win up to 25 times your money. And just to add to it, there's one more new thing as well where you can actually win up to 100 times your winnings. There are now special Demon and Goblin selections. The green ones are actually easier to win, but they result in a lower payout, so not that 100x, but the 100x are these Demon selections. They're harder to win, the numbers are higher, but they equal higher payouts. Just another super fun way to play on Prize Picks. So if you've been waiting to get started with Prize Picks, now is a great time with that offer in the description. Use code SPORTING as well as the free square for Kevin Durant on Christmas Day. Have a great time with Prize Picks, and thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. Now, to get to my eventual point here, it's important to understand why Donovan Mitchell could potentially be available and why he would want to leave in the first place. First and foremost, there were no guarantees made by Donovan Mitchell about wanting to be in Cleveland at the time that the Cavs traded for him. He was excited for a new start. He was excited to play with this young, up-and-coming, very talented team. He could, envision his fit on the team, but at no point did he say he was going to sign an extension. He was always going to be a 2025 free agent, and at this point, it seems like he would like to explore his options, and if you're Cleveland, you don't want to just lose the guy for nothing in that scenario. So part of the reason is because he might not want to be in Cleveland anymore. The other big part of this, though, is that, and this is something that people don't really talk about because they talk about the injuries this year and how the start to the season has been weird. Their playoff performance last year is what started all of this. Had they had a good run in the postseason last year, even with the injuries to begin the season and kind of an iffy start to the year, I think we wouldn't be talking about the Mitchell thing. They would certainly keep him past the deadline, maybe even past the offseason, and then just figure it out. But they won one playoff game last year against a Knicks team that was fine, but they got smoked in the playoffs. And that amount of team success for a guy that's already possibly thinking about going somewhere else, that's how you end up in a situation where one more thing goes wrong, which is a weird start to the year and injuries to begin this season, away from, okay, now it's time for Donovan Mitchell to leave. And thinking back on the trade at the time, I loved the deal for Cleveland because basically what it came down to was there was some smoke about maybe Miami was going to trade for him, but a lot of the rumors were revolving around the Knicks offering, RJ Barrett and some stuff in exchange for Donovan Mitchell. He wanted to be in New York. That kind of seemed like the endpoint destination for him. And then out of nowhere, we got Cleveland with this offer, multiple first, Lowry, marketing contacts, and all these guys. All of a sudden, Donovan Mitchell's in Cleveland. And I loved the deal, not only for Cleveland, because I could see how he could fit alongside Garland, how much they needed another creator on the perimeter because Garland was awesome that year, but everything was on him. Everything offensively in terms of shot creation was on him, and it was just too much for him to handle for them to be a really good team. So I really liked that fit. I also liked the fact that it was a smaller market team taking a gamble on a guy that, generally speaking, they're not going to have the opportunity to bring in. He was young. He was had multiple years left on his contract, and I thought if it went well, it could start this kind of surge of teams in a similar situation to Cleveland trading for guys like Mitchell in the future, where normally they would just end up in these bigger marketplaces like New York. However, obviously, things haven't worked out for them. They didn't play well in the playoffs, weird start to the year this season, and it's very possible that less than 2 years, less than 3 years after trading for Donovan Mitchell, they're going to have to trade him away because they're so concerned about him leaving. And I think that a lot of the conversation and analysis around the eventual Mitchell trade, I do think that at this point it's pretty inevitable that he is going to end up somewhere else, is going to be be that Cleveland made a mistake and that they didn't handle the situation properly and that they never should have made the Mitchell trade in the first place. But to me, that's a very results-oriented thought process. It's very easy to look at the situation now and say, oh, well, things didn't work out in Cleveland and then they had to trade Mitchell, so it was a bad decision in the first place. But the process of how they came to that decision, bringing in Mitchell, what their roster needed, as well as what kind of player he was, still made total sense. Sometimes things just don't work out. NBA team building is hard. Guys get injured. Guys, change their minds and want to change teams. I still am firmly in the camp that even if they trade him at the deadline, even if they trade him in the offseason for a little bit less than what they traded for him in the first place, it was still a good decision. Cleveland was really, really good last year. We were talking about them as a potential conference finals team last year. They were extremely, extremely talented. They just didn't play well in a postseason series. They forgot how to shoot. Their bigs forgot how to rebound, and they didn't have the level of toughness that they needed. And in a scenario in which they made the conference finals last year, everybody would be really excited about how well the Mitchell trade went. And so I think it's an important trade to talk about not only what could happen with him in the future, but also the deal in Cleveland in the first place, because it did make sense. And it's important to think about the process of how they came to that decision and not just think about the results of it. And the final piece of that puzzle to me is what they could possibly get in exchange for Mitchell when they trade him to another team, which again, I think at this point is pretty inevitable, because the concept behind bringing in Donovan Mitchell and trading what they did for him made much more sense than, for example, New Orleans trading for CJ McCollum or a handful of these other, up and coming teams that trade for veterans. Because theoretically, if you're Cleveland and you trade Markkanen, who at the time wasn't that much of an asset, and a couple of picks in exchange for Donovan Mitchell, theoretically in that moment, you can tell yourself, hey, if the worst happens, if we're not very good and then we have a weird start to the year and then we have, him wanting to request a trade or leaving free agency in 2025, in that theoretical universe, we could still get most of, if not all of this value back in exchange for Mitchell, because he's young, because he's still developing, because he's still going to be an asset in 2024 at the same level of an asset that he was when they traded for him. And that to me is the final piece of the puzzle. If they trade Mitchell to the Knicks or to whoever and they get slightly less value, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to say, oh, this was a terrible decision. They never should have made the Mitchell trade. This was awful. To me, it made all the sense in the world and still does, even if they do have to trade him, even if it is a net negative in value for them, because they needed a player like him. They traded for a guy with multiple years left on his deal that was young, that they could still get value out of. And it's not going to set their franchise back that much if they trade him for a little bit less than what they traded for him not too long ago. They're still going to have Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, I would presume, beyond the trade deadline, Darius Garland. They're going to be the version of the Cleveland Cavaliers, essentially, that they were before they traded for Mitchell, the team that gave them some hope of, hey, what could we be if we added another guy to this? They're just going to go back to that team. They're going to be more expensive now because Jared Allen's on a new contract, Max Strus, George Niang. They've brought in some other guys. It's a more bloated roster, and one that, depending on what you get in exchange for Mitchell, is less flexible because you don't have some of your future picks, and it just becomes a little bit more difficult when you're counting on other teams' picks to build your roster. But that doesn't mean that it was a poor decision to trade for Mitchell in the first place. And it's a really interesting example of a team that made the right decision, yet it didn't work out. There are plenty of teams around the league that do things that don't make any sense even in the moment, and then it doesn't work out. Cleveland made the right choice. It just happens that the gamble that they took, which was being good and convincing Mitchell to stay, probably isn't going to work out. But there wasn't a gamble, barring some kind of catastrophic injury. There wasn't a gamble of, what if we don't get enough value in exchange for this guy in 2 years when he wants out? Him being young and being under contract for a few seasons was a critical part of this deal for them. And at this point, who knows? Maybe he ends up staying in Cleveland and they figure it out and they play well in the postseason this year. Obviously, it feels like the sky is falling a little bit because of the Garland injury and the Mobley injury and a lack of development offensively from Evan Mobley since they traded for Donovan Mitchell. All that stuff is definitely a concern, and it's an imperfect roster. They're still looking for a wing that can guard and shoot. They've been looking for that guy for years. It is definitely still an imperfect group, but the possibility does still remain that they keep him beyond the deadline. Maybe he wants to sign an extension if they play well in the postseason, or he just likes it in Cleveland, likes the team, sees that it's a good basketball opportunity for him. Whatever the case may be, it could still happen. I still think it's pretty inevitable that he gets moved, but I do think that it would be good for the league. I said this at the time. If a team like Cleveland got in the, star trading business and actually made it work, that makes me think that in the future, a team like Memphis or Oklahoma City or New Orleans, these up and coming teams that from a basketball standpoint clearly have a better opportunity of winning than, the Knicks or a handful of these other, kind of bigger market teams. These smaller market teams have built their teams the correct way. They drafted well. They've made nice trades, and having those kinds of teams kind of be in pole position for some of these stars the way that the Cavs ended up being for Donovan Mitchell could be good for the long term of the league rather than all these guys just playing in 4 or 5 different cities around the country. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but to me, this is going to end up being one of the more influential trades of the decade, depending on, really regardless of which way that goes.